Leka Devatha, welcome to Pave The Way Podcast. It's awesome to have you here. And I'm really excited to dive into your real estate journey so far because you're very impressive. I actually heard you on the Bigger Pockets podcast 2 years ago, and we have some mutual friends and we connected, and I'm really excited. I'm looking forward to this for a couple of weeks now.
Yay, me too. Thank you for having me on your show.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. So if the listeners are not familiar with you, you have an incredible real estate business you've built now. You got an amazing journey. Just take me through your background. Like, how did you get into the game? What were you doing before real estate? And then we'll jump into your business.
Yeah. So, I grew up in India and moved to the country in 2006. I worked in fashion. I was a merchandise strategy planner for Nordstrom Corporate here in Seattle. And I did that for a good 8 years, I want to say. And ultimately decided that this was not building any financial freedom. I wasn't building a legacy, and I was all about that. I had this entrepreneurial bone in my body. I started my first business when I was 18 years old. And so I kind of wanted to get back into being my own boss. And so in 2014, I was like thick in the middle of what is it that next step that I can take to get on that path and get on that journey. And I was literally driving my car to work one day, and I heard a radio ad for a real estate company, flipping company that was coming to my city. And I was like, what is a flip? Like, what is that? And so I had to go to this presentation, and boy, was I hooked. And within a couple months, I started my business, I quit my job. And I just, there's no looking back. I ended up buying my first property, my first investment property, I think 5 months after that. Wow. And then it's just been a joyride.
So you quit your job that fast. That's impressive. You're a massive action taker. Most people wait years.
I am. No, I think it was just such a calling for me. I was just like, what is this? Why am I so invested already? The education, meeting people in the industry. I was just all about it. And I soon realized that I couldn't do it with a full-time job. I was working 9 to 5, and that's when all the people in the industry could meet me at the same time, coffees, whatever, was during that same time. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to quit my job that I worked so hard to build, and then go do something I don't know anything about, literally jump off a cliff.
What do they say? You build the parachute while you're on your way down,
While you're on your way down.
That's right. That's awesome. So just real quick, before we get into the first deal and the specifics. So you moved to America, I call it America, in 2006.
Yes.
You haven't even been here for 15 years, a little bit. You've been here for, not even that long. So what was it like when you first came? How did that all? Because that's a huge deal. So let unpack that real quick, because that's super impressive, on its own.
Yeah, I never intended to leave India. I just had the best life. I had the best job. My friends and family are all back there. So it was just I met a guy. I met my husband back in India, and he worked here in Seattle. And so we said, okay, let's do this. I'm going to move there. And we got married, and I moved here. And it was cool because he literally has the best friends, who are all some of my best friends right now. But I didn't know anybody. I moved to an absolutely horrendous weather pattern. Everything was always gray and rainy. And so it took some time to build my life here. I'm not going to lie. And that in itself, I think, is just such a big transition moment. When you're doing something like that in the middle of your life, and switching countries, switching jobs, you have to be able to have a lot of hustle and grit.
Yes.
And so, that's kind of how that happened.
That's amazing. Yeah. You moved from India to Seattle. And I've actually never been to Seattle, but I heard it rains quite often
You have never been to Seattle?
No, I got to come. I got to make a trip there soon. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Maybe Colin, you can come over here on his private jet.
Yes. Or we could take his boat up the Pacific coast.
God, that's so fun. Okay, we got to do that this summer.
Yes, I heard the summer's the time to do it. So that sounds like it's in the plans for sure. So you moved to here, you have your corporate job, you eventually quit. So let's walk through your first deal, because that and you know, we've done hundreds of shows.
Yeah.
The first deal for most people is just the hardest thing. It's the biggest rock to move. Let's walk through your first deal. How'd you find it? And then what was the game plan? And then what ended up happening, you know?
Yeah, so I found it by networking a crap ton. I networked with anybody that would spare me 5 minutes of their time. So I actually found an old friend of mine from Nordstrom who had joined an escrow company, escrow and title company here in Seattle. And then he introduced me to a real estate investor who introduced me to his broker, who introduced me to his boss, who has a company, a wholesaling company here. And I ultimately ended up buying my first flip from that guy, from that wholesaler. And it was a disastrous first deal, but I wouldn't have it any other way because I feel like I learned so much from just all the bad things that happened on that deal, because suddenly it sets you up for never having to commit those same mistakes again and just building up on that education, the foundation. So I bought this deal sight unseen. Like, who buys their first deal
Sight unseen in Seattle?
Without walking the property? And it wasn't cheap. It was like a $345,000 distressed property. And back in like 8 years ago, that was expensive. It was an expensive house. And it was not a small house. It was like 2,300 split entry. So I was just going to take on this massive rehab without even knowing construction.
Oh my God.
And not fail at it. So, and so I did that. So I was told that the rehab budget was going to be about 60K. Once I started to and I was promised a contractor from this company. Once I closed on the deal, they said, sorry, our contractor is busy. You're on your own. And so
Oh my
then
gosh.
I lined up contractors to come see this project. And we ended up, I like literally walked 14 different contractors through this project. And then figured out that the rehab budget was really 125. It wasn't 60K. And then and then it was just the process of learning how to flip a house. Finally listed it, and instead of making $100,000 loss, I only made a $5,000 loss.
Oh, that's
And
not bad. Honestly.
that's not bad at all for someone that's doing this for the first time. And it was totally all because I hustled to make that happen. And then, even though it wasn't a very favorable experience, it was a very enriching one. And so I decided to take that experience and then just, blow it up on my next few deals. And every one of them I made a profit on. So
That's awesome. I mean, I give you a lot of respect for doing that, because I mean, my first deal was an assignment and it was like, you know, hard, but it was no risk really. Taking down a sight unseen deal in Seattle with a rehab that's over 6 figures, which is almost like a new construction in some markets. What was the biggest? So when you found out that one contractor couldn't do the job, you know, that you were told, how did you go out to find another contractor? Because I rehab houses. We have a lot of listeners that rehab houses. I've found that the contractors, at least in if you do it wrong, can lead to most of the problems. Hiring the wrong contractor. So what did you do to make sure that you didn't get a contractor who was ultimately a con man, if you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Or con woman.
Yeah. I thought that the best way to do that is by meeting as many contractors as possible to kind of figure out, okay, why does this guy say this when another guy has a different opinion? And so I just lined up as many people. I found them by going to Home Depot at 7 a.m. and looking for people with like contractor jackets. I went to cabinet stores. I put out Craigslist ads. I looked on Thumbtack and Porch. So yeah, and I ultimately found my contractor, the guy that I went with, on Thumbtack. And he wasn't the cheapest contractor, but I knew that just by my interaction with him, that I was going to learn the most from him. And it was about who I could learn from more than who was going to get the job done, because I didn't know that drywalling came after electrical and plumbing. I didn't know that doors and trim didn't go on before, like painting or whatever. So like, I didn't even know the steps involved in construction. I was so green. I didn't know anyone that did this. And so I was just like, okay, who can I learn from? And I learned so much from this guy. I went to the job site every day. I like quickly learned, to do stuff around the job site to make things easy for my contractor. I was so anal about every little detail, which I'm not anymore. I can't, I cannot do that. I know that's detrimental to the project. But back then I drove my contractor nuts.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, you took the time to really learn and get that learning curve shortened. Because now, when you're doing the projects you're doing now, you have that experience to lean back on. And I remember, it's funny you said you'd go to the job site. I used to go crazy. I used to drive to the properties. I'd wholesale to the buyers, and I would like basically be a squatter in the property and be like looking at the paint, looking at the walls, being like, "Oh my
That's
God, this is so
amazing.
cool!" Right?
Yeah,
That's how you learn.
that's how you learn. Absolutely.
Now I can't stand going to job sites. Like, I haven't been to this flip down in San Diego in like 2 weeks, and I'm like, I'll go when it's done, and I'm just like, ugh. I personally don't like going to houses. That's I guess that's a me problem. But
Yeah.
it's interesting how you start. It's there's this quote. It's like, you don't need to have all the resources in the world. You need to be resourceful, right? And you had that desire to go out and win, and you did whatever it took to get that job done. And I mean, I give you a lot of respect just for taking on a deal like that, your first one. And honestly, you almost paid $5,000 to learn millions of dollars worth of lessons. So that's a great way to reframe it, to where someone could have done that and been like, oh, did this flipping thing, it didn't work out, I lost $5,000. But with the right mindset, the amount of value you got from that first deal to propel you into where you're at now is incredible. So I give you a lot of respect for that. That's
Thank
certainly
you.
not easy to do.
Yeah.
In Seattle, out of all places. My goodness, that's like one of the most
I know.
expensive markets in the country. So with that being said, let's fast forward into now. What does your business look like today, 2022? What are you guys doing like on a deal basis, like when it comes to the type of projects you're doing? And what's kind of your vision currently for the company that you've built over the years?
Yeah, so we are currently syndicating big apartment buildings, office spaces, commercial. The goal is to continue to build my rental portfolio here in Seattle.
Okay.
And so I still flip homes because that's the best way to make active income. And, they're pretty lucrative profits on homes here. And especially since I built a pipeline for deal finding, for contractors, for, picking out the best possible finishes to get the most or highest amount of profit. I've kind of figured out my flipping business, and it's kind of on an autopilot. And so that's something that I never want to let go of. But it also gives me the opportunity to buy some really crazy projects. Like, I own an office building right next to Amazon and Facebook in a pretty hot market or a hot street in Seattle. I just syndicated my first apartment building, and it's off to the races. We're looking at a $10 million project next, a $15 million project after that. So we're just growing our syndication business. Also, being on social media, putting myself out there, I think has kind of grown my following. That I have a lot of people that want to invest in my deals. So my last syndication, like, the raise took me 4 days to raise a lot of money. And so I know that this market's also very tech heavy, and it's a good high net worth market. So there's a lot of money, and it's about finding those amazing gems of deals. And I think as market shifts happen, like interest rate hikes, eviction moratoriums, our business and the way we underwrite our deals continues to shift.
Yeah.
And so it's just an ever changing, ever evolving business plan, but that's the only way I like it. Like, I like to be flexible. If you told me like a year ago that I would own an office building and an apartment building, I'd be like, no way. Like, I'm in the single family business. That's my bread and butter. Like that's what I'm focused on. But today I own these buildings, and then tomorrow, like, who knows, a self-storage, assisted living. I'm open to any kind of asset class. I think my common thread with all of them is that I do that in my market, in the Seattle market.
So you like the local model versus some of these other syndicators will buy nationwide, depending on where it is. So I have some questions about Seattle. I'm sure the listeners are curious too. So I'll give you an example to start. I have rentals in New York State, and listen, there's pros and cons to anything in life, especially in real estate. New York State has some of the worst tenant landlord laws I've ever seen. I have evictions now. I haven't had people pay in months and months and months. I'm paying attorneys almost tens of thousands of dollars to get these jerks out. So how do you, in a market like Seattle, where I could imagine it's generally a very tenant friendly place, how do you make the rentals work when there's ultimately less leverage you have as a landlord, as an owner, because of the way the laws are in California, Washington, New York, some of these other areas? So how do you make sure that you can make the deals make sense, but also covering your backside and your investors' backside, with some of these laws? Like, to do an eviction in New York could take 6 months, and then that's normal. So I'm used to that. So I'm sure in Seattle it's similar.
My answer is super simple. You ready? I hire the best property managers. Sophisticated, well-educated property managers. I pay them a solid fee and I let them run my show, because that is not my strong suit. Like, Joe sends me all these texts, like our friend Joe sends me all these texts about his tenants, and I'm like, that's not something that I want to deal with at all. Plus, I'm quite a pushover of a landlord that, I would just give them everything.
Yeah.
And so I started to hire the best property managers for those assets, whether it's a single family, whether it's a high-end rent by room situation, like whatever it is, the most appropriate, well-educated, well-rounded property managers. And what that's doing for me is basically they're so well versed in the laws and rules, and even sometimes they go to all the council meetings, and they're super like in the know, that they're able to bend rules, find loopholes to be able to run my rentals the way it should be run, where it is cash flowing. So if our tenants don't pay, they know how to get the money from the county. Our county pays for tenants, non-paying tenants. And then I think the key is how you vet your tenants. And my property managers do a stellar job, and I know this because I've hired bad property managers where every one of my tenant was basically out of a job within the first 2 months of renting my brand new, newly built fourplex. And so I'm like, I cannot afford that. And so when I started to hire the better property managers, they make sure credit scores match. They make sure they have good employment history. They're stable tenants. So once you pick the right tenants, then the laws don't matter, right?
That is such a nugget. I hope everyone rewinds what you just said. That is such a takeaway, because you could just make your life hell if you don't.
And I can't, like, that's not what I want to focus on. Like, I want to focus on building an empire. And I'm not going to be able to build an empire if I'm focused on what my tenants are doing every day, and how my tenants are not paying $1,000 on one unit. It's not my deal, not my shtick. So I just hire the best to take care of that side of the business.
Hire the best, let them take care of the rest. And I love it. If you have good tenants, the market does not matter. And that is where people, and something that I get involved in, but I know what the deal is now. I'll get good deals from owners direct because of the bad tenants.
Right.
And I used to get all pissed off when I had all these problems, but I'm like, listen, you inherited the tenant for a reason. You got it at a discount.
Yes.
When you put the new tenants in, you get a pro to put them in there, and you vet them. The biggest things I look for, obviously the income, it's got to be at least 3 times what the rent is. Because if the thing I've noticed with tenants, this is a serious problem, is if they're on the financial edge, let's say their tire goes out or their transmission goes in their car, they're going to pay for that before they pay your rent if they don't have a lot of excess money. So I look for the managers look for the income, and then they look for like how much more money are they making compared to the rent? Because if they're not making 3 times as much as the rent, or if they're not making 3 times the money than the rent is, they don't have that access income to weather the storm. And that's where landlords can run into trouble in the tough markets by getting people out. They're kind of stuck. So your answer was spot on there. And at the end of the day, like, managing tenants is not the highest and best use of any investor's time, right? Their best use is finding deals and finding dollars, not dealing with some knucklehead tenant who hasn't paid their rent. That's not a needle moving thing. Going out like you're doing, raising money and finding deals, is what creates the opportunities, which is the best use of your time. So it's good that you've realized that lesson, because some people, it takes them 15 years to realize that, and then they're stuck.
I know. Yeah. And that's hard. I mean, it works for some people, they don't intend to do all the crazy things that other people like me do, but that's just, where I'm at.
Smart. So on your flipping business, so back, you said your flipping business is somewhat automated now, which is awesome. What are you doing to source your flip deals for the active income? Are you relying on wholesalers and agents? Do you have a team doing advertising? How are you sourcing these deals to have consistency?
So here's another true story. I did direct mail campaigns for the first 6 months of my career. I
I love
sucked
mail.
at it so bad. I
Interesting.
just never followed up with sellers that, or reached out to me. And then when I did follow up with them and they said, oh, my house is worth this, like, what can you offer me? I was in no position to tell them what I could offer them. I didn't know what construction costs were. I didn't know why they were analyzing their own homes the way they were. And I was just bad at going to a seller and saying, this is why you should sell me your house. So what I did realize was I was really good at networking with like-minded individuals. And so I found other wholesalers, someone like you, someone like Cole, and really like started to build that network of wholesalers, of amazing people that were very much like me, that like to eat the same things that I ate or drink in the same places I drank, right? So we would just go out to bars and have fun and become friends. And then they would call me on a super secretive special off market deal that they just got. And I would, and hand it to me on a silver platter. And I'm like, I'm done, I'm done with this deal. And literally that is how I have now done, I think, 50 single family flips, 5 massive building renos, and over 75 deals between, maybe 100 deals between listings and wholesales and other stuff. And I want to say about 85% of my deals have come off market from networking with wholesalers. So that's really the only way I buy them.
It's
And
so
now
smart.
it's 100% of my deals. I just stop looking on the MLS because it's just like there's no deals there.
So true.
So it's really when people like not blast out a deal, but like call me and say, I have this amazing deal. Like if it's yours, if you want it,
Yep.
then I'm in.
Because they have the relationship with you and you have the trust and
Yeah.
all that stuff established. And that's something I still do. Well, we do a little bit of everything with the wholesale. So if it's a smoking deal, we'll do an auction system, which is not good for buyers, but good for us. But when we have deals that are either on the fence or like, let's say I grab dinner with a buyer in San Diego and I'm like, hey man, got that. I actually just did this. I'll give you an example on this because it works. I have this property. It's not in escrow yet, but it's in a little bit of a fringe area. Unfortunately, the seller's son got murdered outside the property. So it's in a little bit of a terrible. It's in a borderline neighborhood in San Diego. So I took a buyer with me. I didn't want to go there by myself. I was like, this is kind of sketchy. So I said, hey man, why don't you come with me, roll down to the property with me. We'll walk it together and I'll give you first look at it, and took him over there. He was like, hey, this is where I'd be at. I haven't accepted offer with the seller yet. There's some issues with the deal. But that buyer built the relationship with me and I took him to the property and that's his deal when it's ready to have. And he doesn't have to fight with other investors. It's still a big profit for me and for him.
Right.
And that's how you build a lot of value with wholesalers, because a lot of wholesalers, it is about getting good money for the property. But the most important thing, I've wholesaled hundreds of houses, is knowing the buyer is going to perform and do what they say they're going to do. And the way that you do that is you build relationships with real buyers like yourself who are going to be reliable. And sometimes it makes a lot more sense to take $10,000, $15,000 less when you know that buyer is a personal friend of yours and they're going to do what they say they're going to do, right? There's a lot of value in that versus having some random Joe Blow who came from someone else who says he might get a hard money loan. And then you're like, as a wholesaler, you're like kind of in the middle. You're like, ooh, I don't know. Like this guy might flake out. I might have to close on it. So there's a lot of value in doing what you do by developing those relationships, because you're going to be their go-to person when they have a deal,
Yeah. And I think it's also about building that solid track record. Like you said, from a wholesaler's perspective, I think it's how is this buyer going to perform, right? Are they going to crush the deal? And so more people have eyes on it. And then they come back to me with more deals that I can then find off market. Or are they just going to bomb it, make no profit, and then slam me on social media or whatever? So it's about building that confidence in my wholesalers to say, okay, if she's going to buy a deal, then she's going to close on it for one thing, for sure. And then she's going to crush it. Like every deal that I buy from my wholesaler, I made like 250 to 300K profit. And so if I'm doing that, like they know they have the confidence in bringing me the next few deals.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And I mean, just your market with the margins you can make, everyone can eat, when you have an $800,000, $900,000 house, wholesaler can make 80 to 100 grand. You can make your 300 grand and the economics just work. Like there's just so much meat on the bone with these big deals. Unlike some markets where it's like you're doing a deal in Cleveland and it's like a $200,000 sale price. And like maybe the rehabber makes 40 and the wholesaler makes 10. And it's like, it doesn't really move the needle in your life, No. So kudos for you for doing this in Seattle. Cause a lot of people too, in expensive markets, they think my market's too competitive. My market's too expensive, but there's always benefit to that. Like you can make more money. You don't have to do as many deals.
Right.
And there's ultimately a better economy up there. I mean, the job base in Seattle with Amazon, Microsoft, Google, I mean, it's like people can afford those properties. Unlike, the little thing in San Diego that it's a little scary is like, yeah, there's decent jobs down here and people are moving here, like jobs are moving here, but ultimately it's very expensive. Yeah. And the job market in San Diego is nothing like the job market in Seattle. So the expensive prices here are a little bit more suspect. I mean, yeah, it's a destination city, but in Seattle, you have this great economy where there's so much growth. There's no income tax in Washington. So there's a lot of benefits to, operating there and people can really afford these houses, which keeps the market, in a solid position,
Yeah, I mean, it is high risk, high reward. It's not an easy market for a new investor to easily
I can imagine.
dive into because any project of mine here is an average price point of $1 million for acquisition, rehab, and holding costs. And so that's not, something that like new investors want to just come in and play in. But if you can build strategic partnerships, if you can find good mentors, this is just an incredible market because we have zero inventory. We have 4 weeks of supply. And I think it's a great market to go back and add inventory where there is none.
Yeah. And do development stuff, ADUs and all that stuff. Cause it's so built out. Yeah. There's same thing in San Diego and even in New York, there's no more.
No density.
No way. Yeah, no density. It's so built out. So that's awesome. Well, listen, I want to respect your time. I could talk to you for hours. I'm sure we'll be connecting soon either way. So listen, you added a ton of value to the listeners. I bet you a lot of people are just like, they're going to listen to this over and over and over again. And I encourage them to do that. So Leka, if people want to find you on social media, what is the best social media channel to follow you on? And then also what's the best website for them to check you out if they want to potentially, work with you, maybe sell you deals or get involved in some of your syndications?
Yeah, so I am on Instagram and LinkedIn. LinkedIn is actually one of my favorite professional platforms, best social media channels. So find me, Leka Devatha. And then my website is rehabithomes.com. And you just go check out my projects there.
Awesome. We'll make sure we have that in show notes. And Leka, it was a pleasure having you on the show. And I'm sure we'll talk soon.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.